For the next 5 minutes or so, I'm going to introduce the chemistry of life, a science called biochemistry. So by the end, you should have an understanding of the following ideas: atoms, elements, compounds, molecules, and ions. All matter, all stuff in the universe which has mass, whether it's yeast cells, butterfly, flower, pencil, is made up of tiny particles called atoms. But if we look inside atoms, what we find is that these tiny particles are made up of even smaller particles. So this is showing three basic particles that we find inside atoms: blue ones, red ones, and white ones. And what you notice at first is that the white ones and the red ones are found in the middle, in this particularly dense area. And this middle part of an atom is called the nucleus. And the particles which are found in the nucleus are called protons and neutrons. The particles outside the nucleus are electrons. And protons are positively charged. Electrons are negatively charged. And neutrons have no electrical charge. They are neutral. So we can move on to think about elements. When something is made up of only one kind of atom, it's called an element. And by kind of atom, I mean that the atoms have the same number of protons in the nucleus. So an element is a substance in which all the atoms have the same number of protons in their nuclei. Just to give an example, the simplest kind of element is hydrogen, and all of the atoms of hydrogen have only one proton in their nucleus. So an element is a substance made up of atoms which have the same number of protons. And in nature, there are 92 naturally occurring elements, from hydrogen, the simplest, up to uranium, which is the biggest naturally occurring element. And elements can be arranged in what we call the periodic table of elements. You can see here that it starts off with hydrogen number 1, but it goes up to beyond 92. That's because after 92 there are elements which have been made synthetically, made by humans. But the largest naturally occurring element is uranium at number 92. So here is uranium here. You'll see that all of the chemicals have symbols, which are usually 1 or 2 letters long, and some of them are very familiar to us. Here we have C for carbon, N for nitrogen, O for oxygen, He for helium, Al for aluminium, Fe is a symbol for iron, and just one more common one, Na is a symbol for sodium. So many of these elements are familiar to us. And elements are, of course, all around us. In water we find 2 elements, hydrogen and oxygen. In the air in my cheeks here, or the air around us, we find mostly nitrogen and oxygen. Nitrogen about 79%, oxygen about 21%, and also small amounts of carbon dioxide and water vapor and some others. Salt is made up of 2 elements, sodium and chlorine. Substances which come from living things almost always contain the element carbon. So examples here are sugar, which contains the elements carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, and also paper, which of course comes from trees, and paper also is made up of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. So carbon's a very important element in life. In fact, the chemistry of carbon is an area of science called organic chemistry. What elements are you made up of? Well, a human being by mass would be about 65% oxygen, a bit less carbon, 18.5%, 9.5% hydrogen. Of course, a lot of hydrogen and oxygen because of the water in us, 3% nitrogen, 1.5% calcium, about 1% phosphorus, and some other elements found in small amounts making up another 1%. So this is basically what human beings are made up of. But does that mean that we could get a big bag of oxygen, pile of carbon, a balloon full of hydrogen, another balloon full of nitrogen, a little bit of calcium, a teaspoonful of phosphorus, mix them all together, and we get a person? Of course not. To make up living things, these elements have to be combined, arranged, organised in particular ways. And that leads us on to the idea of compounds. So in living things, elements are almost all combined with other elements to form compounds. What's a compound? Compounds are made up of two or more elements joined together. Not mixed together, but joined together. So there are two examples here. This is a model of oxygen, which is, water, which is made up of two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom to form the compound water, which is written H2O. H2 because there are two hydrogen atoms. And this one here has two oxygen atoms, and this black one here is a carbon atom. So this is CO2, which is carbon dioxide. These atoms joined together, H2O, water, CO2, carbon dioxide, are molecules. Molecules are combinations of two or more atoms joined by chemical bonds. So, what's the difference between a molecule and a compound? Well, in this picture here, we have three different molecules, 1, 2, 3, but we only have two compounds. This here is a compound because it's two different atoms combined, atoms of two different elements combined, This one is also a compound because it's atoms of two different elements combined. But this one here, although it's a molecule, is a combination of two or more atoms. The atoms are actually of the same element, so it's not a compound. This one here is O2, which is the form of the oxygen around us in the atmosphere. This one, as we've already learned, H2O, water, and this one, CO2, carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide and water are examples of molecular compounds. Molecular compounds are combinations of two or more different atoms joined by chemical bonds, as we've learned. But these chemical bonds are formed by sharing electrons. That's one way of forming a compound, but there is another way. And this leads us to our final idea, which is ions. What's an ion? Well, in this picture here, in this atom, suppose the blue are electrons, red are protons, white are neutrons. The overall charge on this atom is neutral because there are 3 protons balanced out by 3 electrons. But what happens if one of these electrons is lost? If that happens, then overall the charge on this atom, if we lose an electron, will be +1. So the overall charge on this atom will be 1 plus. And this thing here will be called a positive ion. So when an atom loses an electron, it becomes positively charged, becomes a positive ion. And this one here has 9 protons, 9 electrons. It has no charge, but if it gains an electron, what will happen? It will become negatively charged. So when an atom gains an electron, it becomes negatively charged. It becomes a negatively charged ion. So ions are atoms which become charged because they gain or lose electrons. And as we know, positive attracts negative, so positively charged ions will be attracted to negatively charged ions. So ionic compounds are compounds formed between ions of opposite charge. And the most familiar example of an ionic compound is salt. Salt is sodium chloride, written NaCl, and this is a compound made of positively charged sodium ions and negatively charged chloride ions. Ions are very important in life science, but here I'll just give one example. This, as we know, is a nerve cell, and the nerve impulse, the message, is sent this way along what we call the axon, and that message is actually the movement of sodium and potassium ions across the cell membrane. So that's one example of the importance of ions in life science. So coming to the end, if you got the main ideas of this little lecture, you should be able to answer these questions. If you're not sure of any, of course, you can go back and listen again.